We're going to be talking about obedience today, about what it means to obey Jesus, even in the midst of difficulties or frustrations or things that don't always work out. How can we be obedient even in the midst of fear? Because we all have fear. We all have things that make us afraid. There's no questions about it. And now as you look at the sheet, I was not in charge of the design of it. So there was some creative licensing of freedom that was taken. If you do not like the picture on there, but that gives us a little bit of clue to the first fear is arachnophobia. This is one I think we probably get. What's arachnophobia? Fear of spiders. All right. So fear of spiders. The second fear on there is ophidiophobia. Does anyone know what that is? Now, it's not spiders, but it's one that a lot of people are afraid of. It is fear of snakes. Did you just guess? Yes. So some of these may be paired together a little bit. So ophidiophobia is the fear of snakes. So we are people who, and snakes are one of those things, and spiders as well. I don't understand why people want a snake as a pet. All the thing wants to do is squeeze the life out of you. That's not a relationship as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, so we're in Judges chapter 6, going into chapter 7 today. And to make sure we set the scene, in the beginning part of chapter 6, the Israelites have sinned against God, and God has handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years, and they're oppressed, they're hiding, they cry out to God. God sends them a prophet, and the prophet said, hey, God did all these things. He brought you up out of slavery in Egypt. He rescued you from Egypt and your enemies. He gave you their land, and the Lord said, I am the Lord your God. You do not worship the God of the Amorites in the land who you now live, but you have not listened to me. You messed up. You rejected me. And then God sends an angel of the Lord to Gideon and greets Gideon and says, mighty warrior, God is with you. Gideon was kind of taken aback and not sure what was going on. And Gideon's like, well, if God is with us, why has all this happened? And we have the back and forth. And the Lord essentially says to Gideon, go with the strength you have to rescue Israel. I am sending you. I am with you. And so that is kind of the recap of what's happening. And God promises to be with Gideon. And remember, this is the goal of redemption. This is where God is moving the redemption to, right? Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we see God is with humanity in the garden. Sin happens, and so we are no longer in the garden. We're no longer with God. But then we get to the end of Revelation and see at the new heavens and new earth, God descends to be with us. God makes his dwelling with us. God lives with his people. So he's restoring that. So that is the goal of where we're going towards with redemption. But in the meantime, we get glimpses of what that will look like. That God is with us, but man, when we get to the new heavens and new earth, it will be even greater than we can imagine now. But what God does is he invites Gideon. He says, come with me in this saving of Israel. Gideon is the leader God is raising up to save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. And God says, come with me. I've got a plan. I'm going to use you. God invites Gideon to participate with him. So God doesn't need us. God didn't need Gideon. He doesn't need you. He doesn't need me. But he invites us to participate in the work that he's doing in this world right here, right now. But we get to Judges chapter 6, verse 27. And it says, so Gideon took 10 of his servants, and he did as the Lord commanded. But he did it at night because he was afraid of the other members of his father's household and the people of the town. Now, in the two verses prior, verses 25 and 26, the Lord commanded Gideon to destroy the idolatrous structures that the people had set up. He needed to destroy the altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole and build a proper altar to God. That is what he was commanded to do, but he did so. There in verse 27, he did it, he obeyed, but he did it at night. And so we have to ask the question, is Gideon brave despite his fear, or does his fear trump his obedience? I think that's a question we can ask. Gideon seemed to have all sorts of self-doubt, needed assurance from God time after time. But we recognize we all have situations we encounter in which we are afraid. Fear is something we all have. But bravery is acting despite fear, or it's acting even though you are afraid. And so Gideon shows us that you can act even if you're scared. So the challenge I have for us today is to recognize that obedience overcomes every obstacle. Everything that is put in front of you, if God has called you, God will overcome that. If I am faithful to God, He will overcome whatever is in front of me. But we are people we're afraid of all sorts of things. We're afraid of this and that, and we have two more that we're going to look at. Acrophobia. Anyone know what acrophobia is? Fear of heights. Yes. What about aerophobia? Flying. I will say some of these will get tougher, but you've probably already looked through it and you know that. But a lot of these we can deduce because of different words within them. So we come to Judges chapter 6, verse 36, and it's starting to get real for Gideon. It's getting to the point where he's got to start acting, and so we have a test that he asks God in verse 36. Gideon says to God, if you truly are going to use me to rescue Israel as you have promised, please prove it in this way. I will put a wool fleece on the threshing floor tonight. If the fleece is wet with dew in the morning, but the ground around it is dry, I will know that you really are going to use me to rescue Israel as you promised. And that is what happened. Gideon got up early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out an entire bowl full of water. So that's the first test that Gideon asked. He wanted assurance. That makes sense. Right? As people, we like to have assurance. We like to know that the things we commit to, we can count on them. You know, the bank likes assurance too, right? They make you sign 1,000 forms and put up collateral in order for them to issue the loan. They want to make sure that they are going to get their money if something happens. But his question was, he put the fleece on the ground, wanted the fleece wet, and the ground dry. So God appeased Gideon's request. And God is affirming his promise to Gideon already that God is with Gideon. God is affirming that to Gideon. So when he's saying to Gideon, he's saying, win or lose, we're going to be together. God is inviting Gideon to participate with him in his plan to save Israel. But win or lose, God is inviting Gideon to join him, that they're going to be together. Because the outcome, whether we win or lose, is not the goal. When God calls us to something, when he puts an expectation in front of us, the winning or losing is not the goal. The goal for us is to be obedient. See, if we just focus on the goal, we may try to find un-Jesus ways to get there. See, the goal is not to achieve this, whatever this may be, but it's to be obedient with God. And one of the things I have to remind myself time and time again is how my mentality works. Because to me, the journey is not the destination. When I'm going on a trip, the destination is the destination. The car ride is not the destination. That's how my mind works. But with God, it's not the end goal that we're getting at. We are being obedient to God every step of the way, and that is what he calls us to. But sometimes our fear gets in the way. Our fear gets in the way in all sorts of things. And one of those is the one that people probably use sometimes, is that of hypochondria, which is the fear of illness, sickness, something of that nature. What about mysophobia? Oh, yes, sorry, I was thinking of a different one. Yes, it is the fear of germs. Yep. So fear of illness and fear of germs. And we think of our society today, even if you aren't diagnosed with something like a phobia like this, we are scared of this type of stuff. Right? We are overly concerned with our physical health. And we say things like, why haven't they figured that out yet? Why haven't they figured out how to solve that problem or cure that illness or prevent this from spreading? Why haven't they figured that out yet? Whoever they may be, we don't know, but we want they to figure it out. With all the advances in technology, how come this isn't solved yet? But we come back to Gideon, and we finish the chapter 6, 39 and 38 and 40. And Gideon said to God, he said, please don't be angry with me, but let me make one more request. Let me use the fleece to issue one more test. This time, let the fleece remain dry while the ground around it is wet with dew. So that night, God did as Gideon asked. The fleece was dry while the ground was covered with dew. Gideon wanted assurance. He wanted more assurance. He came back to God for another question. Now, if we're honest, this seems logical to me. All right, now I don't know how the science would work, but it is possible that somehow the fleece could be wet with dew while the ground would remain dry. Somehow that might work from I don't know if it's a meteorological standpoint or whatever word we describe there. But now Gideon said, let's make sure that wasn't a coincidence. Let's make sure that wasn't just a natural phenomenon that happens. Let's reverse the test, have the fleece dry and the ground wet. So Gideon asked for this. And now I struggle with Gideon a little bit here because it seems as though he just keeps testing God. You may remember in Matthew chapter 4 when Jesus is tempted by Satan, one of the things Jesus, he uses scripture to refute the temptations, but he quotes Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 16, says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Doesn't that seem what Gideon is doing here? He keeps testing God. He actually says, let me do one more test. Let me use the fleece for one more test. Well, see, I think what's happening here, though, is Gideon is coming to God with humble vulnerability. You know, if I question God with hostility, that's a lot different than coming to him to say, God, I'm still not sure if I got it figured out. I know you've told me this 5 times. But can you please help me? And I think that's how Gideon is coming to God. He's coming to God with humility. And God comes to Gideon again. And he reiterates, by answering this request, he reiterates his promise to be with Gideon. He reiterates the promise to Gideon that win or lose, God is going to be with Gideon. Because again, the outcome is not the goal. Whether Gideon is successful or fails, from a worldly standpoint, is not what God is calling him to be. He's calling him to be obedient. But fear gets in the way. Fear prevents us from stepping up and doing what God calls us to do. So got a couple other phobias here. Trypanophobia. Who knew that one? Did you know it? You knew it? Man, I'm proud of that one. That's a good one, Christian. So I was not sure anybody would get that one. Well, we have some nurses in here. We might have been able to get that one. I don't know. But what about claustrophobia? Tight spaces, closed spaces, something of that nature. Fear of jogging. Thank you. But now the reality is sometimes our fears are irrational. And needles are I think, are a good example of if it's a needle like an insulin shot needle, those are really, really small. They still hurt, okay. But that's a lot different than if you're giving blood. The needle to give blood, that sucker's huge, right? And I don't know where the fear of needles came from or how that derived, but it hurts, but it's pretty limited. The pain is contained, and it doesn't last forever. Now, it can last a long time. You can have lingering effects. But closed spaces is another one. Like, now, if we're in Star Wars and the trash compactor is closing in, okay, be afraid. But closed spaces, like, the wall's not going anywhere. And I've had moments of this where I've struggled with that. But the reality is, there's nothing to be afraid of at that moment. But I think what happens, particularly with something like claustrophobia, what happens with God is we don't want God to put us in a box. God, don't tell me to go there. I'm out of my comfort zone there. That makes me uncomfortable. I don't like that. And say, God, don't do these things. Don't put me in this section. I want my freedom. I want to be able to escape. I think that's part of what claustrophobia is. I'm scared I'm not going to be able to get out. We're scared that God's going to call us something and we're not going to be able to escape it. That's pretty terrifying when we think of it. That really releases control to God when we do something like that. We're going to continue in chapter 7 and verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, You have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. Therefore, tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave the mountain and go home. So 22,000 went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. Now let's make sure we understand the context here. So first off, Gideon has 32,000 soldiers. Midian, we find out later, has 135,000. And God comes to Gideon and says, "You got too many." I think you're talking to the wrong people, God. The Midianites have too many. But partially, I think what you could say is what God is coming to Gideon and say, "Hey, Gideon, you've done too good a job raising people to come and rescue Israel. I've called you to lead the people to rescue Israel from the hand of the Midianites. You've done too good a job of getting people excited and joining you on that." And so he's taking them away. He's taking away the people who are timid or afraid. Now, the issue, God is saying there's too many because he doesn't want Israel to think that they did this on their own strength. And that's really important. And chapter 6 sets this up for God to get to this point. Because what happened is that Israel had forgot the Lord their God. That was the core issue of what had happened. When God sent the prophet to tell the people, "Hey, God rescued you out of slavery in Egypt. He rescued you from them. He rescued from those who oppressed you. He gave you their land. He said, don't worship their gods. But you have failed to listen." And then we get to Gideon. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, and Gideon says, "Well, if God is with us, why has all this happened? Where's the God who did the things that our ancestors told us about? The God who brought us out of Egypt. Where is that God?" See, the people had forgotten who God was. The people had forgotten that God was with them. See, the issue was not that Gideon had a certain amount of people. And an argument can be made, the issue wasn't actually the mentality of the soldiers. The issue was that people had forgotten who God was. And God was going to remind them. And one of the ways he was going to remind them was to make sure they were so weak, there is no conceivable way possible that they could be successful. I'll tell you what, that's a scary thought, isn't it? Because we're forgetful people as well. We like to harp on Israel and saying, "Oh, those people, they've really fumbled that up. They were just clueless people who kept messing up time and time again." Well, we are too. We need to be reminded who God is. And sometimes we get so far away from God that the only way for us to remember who God is for God to humble us completely. And I don't like that. I understand why God has to do that, but I don't like the fact that I put myself in a position where I have to suffer even more in order to recognize who God is. But God knows what's best for me. God knows what I need. He knows how to get me to where he needs me to go. Now, there may be some practical applications to this as well, because something like fear is contagious. If you have a unit of soldiers and they are afraid and you can't trust how they're going to behave and how they're going to act, if you don't trust the soldier next to you, that's a bad deal. That's a dangerous situation. And so there could be some practical applications to it as well. But I've always wondered, was Gideon tempted to join the timid and afraid soldiers? Because up to this point, we've seen he's been afraid. He acted at night out of fear. He didn't think he was a mighty warrior. When God came to him and said, "Hey, I'm going to use you to rescue Israel from the hand of the Midianites," Gideon said, "My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least of my entire family." He tried to say, "Hey, I'm not the right guy. You got the wrong person. You need someone else." But I think the timidness and fear of the soldiers was perfectly legitimate, right? It's legitimate to be afraid, but sometimes when we're consumed by fear, that can drive us to places that are unhealthy for where God wants us to go. God calls us to be courageous. He calls us to obedience because obedience overcomes every obstacle. But I have a couple more, two more phobias I want to mention here. Thanatophobia. Does anyone know what that is? Fear of death. Yeah, Christian coming in clutch again. So fear of death. And then xenophobia. What? Foreigners? Strangers? Anybody else? The unknown. Fear of the unknown is what I had. It maybe you can. This is not ironclad. I may be wrong on some of these, so don't quote me. But I Googled it, good or bad, so take that for what it's worth. But fear of the unknown. And I think sometimes that might be what the soldiers were facing. They were fear of death, but also the fear of the unknown. You know, when God calls us to things, very, very rarely does God give us the full blueprint layout of everything. He says, just trust me. Just start the journey. And I'll tell you what, fear of the unknown is a really big deal. You know, I've said things before, if I know how it's going to work out, I could get through it. If I know how it's going to end, good or bad, I can get through it now. It helped me now. Because we have a fear of things we do not know. We struggle with that. Now, some more than others. Some of these fears may really resonate with you. Some of them may not. But the fact that we have fear, and it can sometimes drive us away from what God wants to do in our lives. But then in verse 4, God told Gideon, there are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I will test them to determine who will go with you and who will not. So when Gideon took his warriors down to the spring, the Lord told him, divide the men into two groups. And one group, put those who cup the water with their hands and lap it up with their tongue like dogs. And the other group, put those who kneel down and drink with their mouths from the spring. Only 300 men drank from their hands. All the others got down on their knees and drank from their mouths, with their mouths from the spring. So the Lord told Gideon, with these 300 men, I will rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home. So Gideon collected the provisions of all the other warriors and sent them home, but he kept the 300 men with him. Let's make sure we understand there were 135,000 Midianites. Gideon started with 32,000 men, whittled down to 10,000, and God said there's still too many. And it only left him with 300. That's where Gideon ended. That's where God stopped that's where God stopped taking men away from Gideon. God decreased his army again. Now there's a question of what does this second test mean of how the soldiers drank water. And there are different theories of maybe those who knelt down all the way and put their mouth in the water. They were alert, they could be prone to attack, so they weren't people who would stay alert and vigilant. Lapping the water up in your tongue like dogs. Maybe there's a concept of they are soldiers who will fight like dogs, and those are the ones you really want with you. Regardless of what the point of the test is or isn't, the reality is the conclusion that God was getting this army size down. The point is to decrease the size. Now we're not going to go to the conclusion of the story here today. But what happened is God defeated the Midianites with the 300 warriors with Gideon. That's what happened. Now there were some tactics like some lanterns and some confusion that God put upon them. But it was 300 soldiers defeated the 135,000 Midianites. See, but sometimes I think God tests our faith. And we don't like it. We don't like tests. We didn't like tests in school. If you have to go down to the DMV and they actually make you take the test, you're like, oh, I don't want to do this. We don't like tests. But God tests our faith for a couple of reasons. One, maybe God tests our faith to affirm that our faith is real, not counterfeit. So we know that we actually truly trust in God. And the second reason is that God might test our faith in order to strengthen it. You know, teachers try to say this, we only test you to show that you have the real knowledge or to help you improve in your knowledge, right? And we don't like it, but we do it because we're told we have to. We don't like being tested, but God tests us to draw us closer to Him. That's the reality. So when you're going through a difficult time, You can ask yourself, oh, why is this happening to me? Or you can ask yourself how is this drawing me closer to God? How is this revealing Jesus in me? Even if the situation is terrible, even if I am terrified of what's happening, how am I getting closer to Jesus? So I come back to the concept of obedience overcomes every obstacle. Now, when I say overcomes, it may not be overcome in the way that you think is best. There may be a situation in front of you that say, I don't know how I can thrive or succeed or not be consumed by this. God can overcome that situation. If I'm obedient to God, He will overcome that situation in my life. It may not be how I want it to be. It may not be overcome the way I think and or hope it will be, but God will overcome it when we're obedient to Him. Now, another phobia we have, and you probably get this one, with the drinking of the water, I thought that might be beneficial. Aquaphobia, fear of water. Now, I don't know if this extends to like swimming or not wanting to get in the pool or something like that, but it is another fear we have, and people are scared. We go out in this world, I think we can see, if we recognize people are acting out of fear. I mean, our politicians know how to use that. They try to get us scared that if the other side wins, the world is going to end. Like, think of all the terrible ramifications if this person wins and we got to support our candidate, whoever that is, and that's the only way good things are going to happen. You see, like Gideon, we want constant assurance. And the great thing is that God meets us where we are. So I don't know where, maybe you're super pumped and excited and on fire for Jesus right now. Jesus meets you where you are. Maybe you doubt Jesus a lot. Maybe you're not sure if Jesus is really worth following. Jesus meets you where you are. And Jesus is not, He doesn't want us to hide our doubts. See, Gideon came to God with all these doubts. If you really are going to use me as you promised you would, please prove it in this way. Now, if we come to God with arrogance and righteous indignation, like we know better, that's a bad situation. But if we come to God with humility and vulnerability, saying, God, if this is really what you want, please show me. I'm desperate for you to give me assurance. Now, eventually, God calls us to step out in faith for Him. He says, take the risk. You're ready. I may not feel ready, but God says you're ready. You need to move now. So these 300 men stood their ground and they showed courage. Now it's interesting, they didn't actually attack the Midianites, initially at least. They had to chase them down afterwards. But God did it. God showed up. God displayed His power and showed Israel that He delivered them from the hand of their oppressors. It was only God that it happened. It wasn't because Israel was superior or had better forces or better strategies. It was because God showed up. So God doesn't need you. God doesn't need me. He didn't need Gideon. He doesn't need any of us. But God chooses us. He invites us to participate with Him in the work that He's doing. God wants to bring victory through you specifically. Not through somebody else. I mean, He does want to bring victory through somebody else, but don't try to deflect it to somebody else. God wants to use you to bring His purposes into this world. We have to recognize our own fears. What is preventing us from being faithful to Jesus? And so these last two are I'm going to butcher. If you looked at them, you're like, I wonder how he's going to pronounce that. Metathesiophobia. Boom. Got it. You were not impressed by that. Man alive. Come on. Yeah, thank you. I was really proud of that. Anyone know what that is? Fear of change, fear of new things. Yes. And aphenphosphobia. Anybody know what that is? Intimacy is the word I found, but touch is probably fills in with that or include that. Fear of change and fear of intimacy. You know, I think the longer we've been followers of Jesus, probably those two are big things for us. Because you know, the longer we've been a follower of Jesus, the more we've convinced ourselves that we got to have it all figured out. I got to look like I am put together. Somebody says, how you doing? I said, I'm doing fine. I'm doing good. I'm okay. There's no issue here. Those are the phrases we use. See, I don't want to change, but I also don't want to be close to anybody either. Because if I get close to somebody, they're going to see my flaws. They're going to see the ways that I don't measure up. They're going to see the ways where I fall short. And that's hard. That's a heavy burden for us to carry. That's difficult for us. But I come back to the fact that obedience overcomes every obstacle. Maybe some of these fears resonate with you. Maybe some of them don't. That's not the issue. The issue is that we have things that hold us back from God. Oftentimes those are fears. Not every time necessarily, but sometimes they are. But what's holding you back? What areas in your life is God calling you to be courageous? Because God's calling you to be courageous somewhere. It's not if He's calling you to be courageous, He's saying what areas are, and what fears do you have that are holding you back? Maybe we can come back to last week. What excuses do you have? What's preventing you from following Jesus and the full scope that He wants you to follow Him? Because Jesus invites you to follow Him not to make life more difficult for you, but to bring victory through you, to bring His purposes through you, to show the world who He is because of our obedience. And it's only because of our obedience that we get to be privileged to be part of that. So what's holding you back? How is God calling you to be courageous?